Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Holy Comforter Episcopal Church and the Fall 2020 Adult Christian Formation series called Liturgy, the Work of the People. These past few episodes have been the postscript as we gathered and discussed. Some more topics came up that I wanted to share with you and to discuss and to talk about. Now, you'll see that my setting is a little bit different, and you see my Christmas tree there in the background. And I think, like we've all experienced during this time of pandemic, is that we've had to be flexible and resilient. So you see that I'm recording from a different place today. Remember, the guiding question is, why do Episcopalians do what we do when we gather on Sundays and other special days of the year in the presence of God? Now, there are lots of things that we did not get to. We could just name some of them here. Confirmation. At Holy Comforter, I've done a number of quinceañeras. We didn't talk about any of those rites of passage. We didn't talk about blessings at homes. We didn't talk about ministration at the time of death, or the Great Litany, or the daily office, or how Episcopalians cooperate or don't cooperate with other liturgical traditions. Roman Catholic, Orthodox, United Methodist, Lutheran. So there are lots of things that we didn't get to. But there's one thing that I do want to get to today, and that is the burial of the dead. I think it's fitting that this is truly the last of this series, so I thought that we should discuss burial. Now, if you'd like to pause right here, I encourage you to go to your prayer books and read page 491. That's the opening anthem for burial services. To read the commendation on page 499. And then on page 501, read the committal or the graveside service. So you can pause here. That's pages 491, 499, and 501. Now, I want to clarify some of the vocabulary and nomenclature that we're going to use in this session. In the Book of Common Prayer, the service is entitled the burial of the dead. And it's called that whether there's a coffin, whether there's an urn, or no remains at all. It is always called the burial of the dead. Now, I do know that some traditions differentiate between funeral services and memorial services. That can sometimes cause confusion, say, with other people who are coming to a burial service. They say, like, well, is there a body there? It's like, no, but we always call it burial. It always goes around and around like that. But just to clarify, we as Episcopalians always call this service the burial of the dead. Now, I've also heard the service called a celebration of life, and lots of well-meaning people will say, well, I don't want it to be a funeral. I want it to be a celebration of life. And I've heard that more and more. And I just like to say that I think that is part of our death-denying culture. I mean, we are gathered because the individual has died. And yes, we honor their life. But at the same time, what we are celebrating is the one who gives life and who gives life beyond death, who is God Almighty. So it should not always just be a celebration of that individual's life. We are here to celebrate the Lord God who has trampled over death to give us new life. So that's just some of the nomenclature there. Now, a burial service in the Episcopal Church is a balancing act. And like I just intimated, we want to honor and remember the individual who has died. But at the same time, we are gathered there in the church. So it is primarily a worship service of the Lord God Almighty. And we always try to keep that in balance. And I think we've all been to burial services or have seen them where something kind of gets out of balance, where it becomes just about the person, about how great they were and all the good things they did. And oftentimes that's very true. But again, we're in a church, so we also have to say that we are gathered here today to celebrate the one who gives life beyond death. At the same time, we've also seen funerals, worship services where it is just about God, and you kind of forget that you're even there for a funeral. Like, it's almost as if the person is an afterthought. So again, we're always going to be trying to keep those two things in balance. Now, one of the real practical ways that we do that in the Episcopal Church is that we don't do open caskets. The prayer book is very clear that if there is a coffin, it is closed before the service starts. And one of my favorite parts of the funeral service, the burial service, is when the altar guild puts out the funeral pall on top of the casket before it enters the church. And then no one really knows if that coffin costs tens of thousands of dollars or if that coffin is a 6-foot pine box. There's a real beauty in having one pall that goes over the casket to say, everybody here is equal. That death is the great equalizer. We are all mortal before God, and there is just one pall that we use. Same thing for an urn. You could have the last remains, the ashes from a cremation in a mason jar, or you could have it in a super nice urn. It doesn't matter. We're going to put a pall over it. And I think part of that is that we're all equal here, and that we're all equal as sinners, as those who have died, but before the eyes of God. And I'll say too is that I've done funerals at Holy Comforter where both of those are true, where I've used, or the coffin has been quite literally a 6-foot pine box. And I've done them where they are very nice, top-of-the-line coffins and caskets. But again, we put a pall over it, so at the end of the day, we are seen to be equal before God. That's part of that balancing act. Now, I used this slide back in episode 3 to talk about liturgical time, the concept of liturgical time. But I think here it happens at funerals. It happens especially at funerals. We talked a little bit about this in weddings also. So think of the layers of things that are happening at a funeral. And I think this is something that really we should honor as liturgical Episcopalians. First of all, we gather to remember the person who has died. And so we think back on all of our memories of that person. That's the first thing that happens. The second is we remember all the saints of God who have died in the past. All of our family, our ancestors, those examples of the faith who have gone even before them. I think that's part of what the liturgy does, is that we think about other deaths that have been meaningful for us. And then we also think forward, and we think about our own death. I mean, at least I do when I am standing there with a coffin or a casket, when I'm standing at the graveside, I ponder my own mortality and wonder, who is it that's going to be at my graveside? Who is the priest that's going to preside at my burial service? Who will be there? Where will that be? What will it be like? So we always think forward to our own death. Then, of course, we think backward to the resurrection of Jesus Christ that took place on Easter Day. Our burial services, the note in the prayer book says, are Easter services. This is an Easter liturgy. It is resurrection. So we put out the white, and I've seen lilies, you've seen Easter hymns. So we think back to Easter services, but primarily to the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And then at the same time, because of the resurrection of Jesus, we think forward to our own resurrection when we are raised from the dead. If y'all know Charlie Parr, he's a great singer. He's got a great song, "Ain't No Grave Gonna Hold My Body Down." It's really a song about the resurrection. Ain't no grave gonna hold my body down. And I think that also comes up in funeral services as we think ahead to our own resurrection. Now, this is something that always comes up in the Episcopal Church. If you're going to hit pause here and turn to page 495. You see at the bottom, there's a rubric that says, here there may be a homily by the celebrant or a member of the family or a friend. Now, remember how the rubrics work grammatically. The preference is always put first in the list. This is not an accident. You see this all throughout the rubrics in the prayer book, is that whenever there are options, they are listed in order of preference, unless they're listed alphabetically, and that shows that there is no order of preference. Those people who drafted the prayer book were pretty clever about this. So I read this as the preference is for the celebrant to give the homily. And this is what I have found. And this could be my own experience. The people and families who come to church, who are regular in worship, they want me to give the homily. That's just what I have found. They have heard my preaching over a number of years. They see me as their pastor. They see me as their priest. And they want to hear a word of good news. They want to hear my reflections on the gospel. They want to hear what I have to say about the individual who has died. In my experience, the people and the families who don't come to church, who are not regular in worship, they want a friend or a family member to give a eulogy. Now, that's not a hard and fast rule, but it's been the rule of thumb that I have seen. That when people or families see me as their pastor, they see me as their priest, they want to hear from me. When people don't see me in that way, then it's not important for them to hear from me. Which of course always makes you wonder, why have you even asked me to conduct a service anyway? If you don't want to hear what the church has to say about death, resurrection, Jesus Christ, and the meaning of this person's death in light of the gospel, well then why even have it in a church? Why even ask for my attendance or for my leadership? I don't know. Maybe you have a different experience, but that's something that I always think about is I wonder why people have even come to church, who haven't been to church in years, asking me to lead the service. And that's something that I'm still thinking through and working through. And the reason I'm always pretty firm that I think a member of the clergy should give a homily is because we are specially trained to hit that balance, to make sure that, yes, we honor the one who has died and we remember their life and we celebrate that life. But at the same time, we talk about the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ and what God has done through Jesus for all people in promising new life beyond the grave. And so it's all about striking that balance. Now, I just want to take a point of personal privilege here, because I think every priest and pastor has some important reflections on burials. And in a way, I think we mark our pastoral ministries in a place by the burials that we've done. Not really the high holy days, not really the weddings. I think for many of us, it's the funerals that help us mark the passage of time. So I want to share with you some of my own personal reflections and stories, and hopefully that will enlighten you about why we do this liturgical thing that is a burial. So in the bottom right, that is St. Albans Episcopal Church in Waco, Texas, where I was an assistant rector. My last day in the office, I had a burial service. It was a big one. There is a large Lebanese family that lives in Waco, and they have members spread out across all three Episcopal churches there in Waco. And one of the matriarchs had died, and I had done the last visit to this individual in a nursing home. I then met with the family to do the funeral planning. I conducted the service. I got in the passenger seat of the hearse, drove with the casket to the cemetery, did the graveside service, drove back in the hearse to the parish hall where there was a big reception afterwards with all of this big family. And for me, it really did mark the end of that era at St. Albans. That it felt like, also in a way, that it was my final preparation to become a rector, and that I actually could do all of this on my own. On the top right, you see that's a picture of I-45, obviously. There was a charter member of Holy Comforter, Walter Bounds, who died a few years ago. I did his burial service at Holy Comforter, the old nave. And we drove to the Earthman Rest Haven Cemetery right off 45. And it was amazing. The police escort actually shut down 45. So there was no one else around. It wasn't like there were other traffic in the other lanes. It was completely blocked off. And it felt like God was making everybody notice the passing of Walter Bounds. Everybody knew that someone had died. No matter if you were in a rush, if you were trying to get somewhere on 45, death, and it's true, death is this thing that we cannot avoid. It was a thing that made everybody stop and notice. And I'll never forget that, driving behind the hearse and all the police escort and seeing 5 lanes of I-45 completely clear, and all of us making our way in a funeral procession to the cemetery. Just that stark reminder that death is coming for each of us, and that the whole world is going to stop. Oof, man, gave me some chills. On the bottom left, you see a picture of Ash Wednesday. Because every year, as I'm imposing ashes, I think at least one of these people I'm going to bury in the next year. And for them, quite truly, they will become ashes to ashes, dust to dust. And it's happened. And I have no other words than to say it is a poignant pastoral moment every year during Ash Wednesday when I think about all of these souls that have been entrusted to my care, for some of them during that next year, that they won't see the next Ash Wednesday. And the top left, that's a picture of some brisket and sausage and ribs. When I was a hospital chaplain at the Texas Children's Hospital in Dallas, there was a pediatric palliative care doctor. Just think of that, a pediatric palliative care doctor. I mean, this doctor saw death all the time. And we were talking through one particularly tough death, and he said to me that he has a liturgy of his own that he does after every death. He gets a lollipop, and he eats the lollipop, and he thinks about that child who has died, and he reminds himself that he has done what he could do. And that is a way for him to mark that passage, to say, I can move on from this, honoring that person, that child, and just moving on. And I think about the life of a priest, that these people that we preside over their burials, we love them too, but in a way, we are so busy with the burial planning and the preparing a sermon and actually doing the service, our own mourning and grief can get lost. So typically after a funeral, I go get barbecue by myself. Barbecue, it's terrible for you. I don't eat it very often. But for me, it's a way to mark this very special thing that has just happened. And I sit there and I eat and I reflect on the goodness of God, the goodness of a meal. I think about that line from Isaiah about the feast that is coming at death. And I have my own little feast, and I celebrate and think about that person who has gone to go feast with Jesus in the heavenly country. So those are some of my reflections on burials and what they've meant for my own pastoral ministry. So finally, journal question number 16. Why do you go to burial services? I mean, really, why? If someone has died, what's the point? I'd like for you to spend a little bit of time in a journal just asking yourself and writing why you go to burial services. Thank you so much for this time, for spending this time with me and thinking about liturgy, and in this small postscript series, a few other additional things. Thank you so much for the comments and the questions that keep coming my way. If you have any more, please keep those up, and I'd love to hear from you.